The Power of Stupidity. By Giancarlo Liveraghi. Chapter 1, The Stupidity Problem. Stupidity is a nasty problem. I have always been fascinated with human stupidity. My own, of course, as well as all sorts of stupid attitudes and obnoxious mistakes messing up everyone's life every day. That's a big enough cause of anxiety. But things get much worse when one has a chance to find out how powerful and influential people decide and behave on matters that have large-scale, and long-term, consequences. We generally tend to blame awful decisions on intentional perversity, selfishness, astute mischievousness, megalomania, etc. They are there, of course, in staggering quantity. But any careful study of history, or observation of current events, leads to the invariable conclusion that the single biggest source of terrible mistakes is sheer stupidity. This fact is quite widely understood by anyone who has had a chance to look into the subject. It's effectively summarized in Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. 1. The concept was confirmed by Robert Heinlein in a shorter and simpler statement: never underestimate the power of human stupidity. When stupidity combines with other factors, as happens quite often, the results can be devastating. In many situations, human stupidity is the origin of a series of events that combine into constantly increasing complication, with effect that can be quite funny, until we discover that they are tragic. In other cases, stupidity is not the origin of the problem, but all sorts of stupid behaviors make it worse and prevent effective solutions. A fact that surprises me, or does it, is the very little amount of study dedicated to such an important subject. There are university departments for the mathematical complexities in the movements of Amazonian ants, or the medieval history of Param Island, but I have never heard of any foundation or board of trustees supporting any studies of stupidology. 2. The origin of Hanlon's razor is uncertain. It can be considered as a corollary to Finagle's law of dynamic negatives, which is similar to Murphy's law, see chapter 4. It's inspired by a classic, Occam's razor, and it's equally sharp. Hanlon is probably a phonetic variation on the name of Robert Heinlein, who had stated that concept in his novel Logic of Empire in 1941. A stupidity class was announced by the Occidental College in 2009, but it's irrelevant. In the literature of all times there are several comments, and descriptions of facts, that can help us to understand the problem. But very few books that get into any depth on this issue. One I read when I was a teenager, but never forgot. It is called A Short Introduction to the History of Human Stupidity by Walter B. Pitkin of Columbia University, and was published in 1934. 3. I found it by chance many years ago while browsing around old bookshelves, and, much to my delight, I still have it. Old as it is, it's still a good book. Some of Professor Pitkin's observations appear extraordinarily correct 70 years later. Even before reading the book, there is an obvious question. Why did he call a 300-page book a short introduction? At the end, it says, Epilogue, now we are ready to start studying the history of stupidity. Nothing follows. Professor Pitkin was a wise man. He knew that a lifetime was far too short to cover even a fragment of such a vast subject. So he published the introduction, and that was it. For one of Pitkin's observations is that it is difficult to study stupidity because nobody has a really good definition of what it is. Geniuses are often considered stupid by a stupid majority, though nobody has a good definition of genius, either. But stupidity is definitely there, and there is much more of it than our wildest nightmares might suggest. In fact, it runs the world, which is very clearly proven by the way the world is run. See chapter 10, The Stupidity OD Power. A few years later, 1937, also Robert Musil, in his lecture on stupidity, noted how scarcely studied was the shameful domination that stupidity has on us, and commented dismally that he had found unbelievably few predecessors in dealing with this subject. In recent years the literature on stupidity is somewhat less scarce. But all authors probing into any depth find that there is a lack of studies on this subject. When we try to understand stupidity, we are dealing with a subject that is scarcely studied, rarely understood, broadly avoided because it's uncomfortable and disturbing, as we shall see in chapter 28. It's as though we all knew that we are stupid, but we're uneasy about admitting it. We are not going to solve the problem by being afraid of it, or pretending that it isn't there. So let's venture into the tricky swamps of human stupidity and see what we can find. It is reported that also Jorge Luis Borges, in 1934, started writing a Historia Universal de la Infamia, but gave up when he found that the task was too big for a lifetime. Gustave Flaubert was always obsessed with stupidity, but he was never able to complete his planned encyclopedia on this subject, see chapter 28. 4. In Pitkin's opinion, 4 people out of 5 are stupid enough to be called stupid. That was 1.5 billion people when he wrote the book, it is over 5 billion now. Of course he didn't mean to say that such figures could be taken literally. But the fact is quite worrying. See chapter 25, Is Stupidity Growing? The essence of stupidology is trying to understand why things go wrong, and how that is due to human stupidity, that causes most of our problems. But even when stupidity is not the original source of a mishap, its consequences often get worse because of our stupid reactions and clumsy attempts to find a solution. This analysis is essentially diagnostic, not therapeutic. 5. The basic concept is that, if we get to understand how stupidity works, we have a better chance of controlling its effects. We can't defeat it altogether, because it's part of human nature. But its impact can be less harmful if we know that it's lurking everywhere, we understand how it works, and so we are not taken by total surprise. Some readers may feel that it's too soon, in this first chapter, to quote some authors that have interesting things to say about stupidity. But I believe that they are properly placed here. Not just to give credit to those who deserve it, but, more importantly, to begin to set the environment for the development, in the rest of the book, of a subject that is generally undervalued or misunderstood. In chapters 5 and 6 we shall discuss the key contributions of two brilliant authors, Cyril N. Parkinson and Lawrence Peter, who didn't write about stupidity, but help us to understand why things don't work. And chapter 7 is about the basic laws of human stupidity as defined by Carlo Cipolla. Of course, interesting contributions are offered by Scott Adams, not only in his famous Dilbert strips, but also in his books about what's wrong with organizations, including the Dilbert Future, Thriving on Business Stupidity in the 21st Century, 1997, that isn't an essay on stupidity, nor an exercise in forecasting, but a sharply ironic description of the structural and cultural decay in business enterprises. An exception in the general scarcity of academic work on this subject is Stupidity by Vidal Ronell, University of Illinois, 2003. She confirms a basic fact: stupidity is hard to define and poorly understood. Essentially linked to the inexhaustible, stupidity is also that which fatigues knowledge and wears down history. And it is a serious problem. Neither a pathology nor an index as such of moral default, stupidity is nonetheless linked to the most dangerous failures of human endeavor. Stupidity, says Robert Sternberg, in his preface to Why Smart People Can Be So Stupid, Yale, 2002, is a subject which the vast majority of theories in psychology, including theories of intelligence, seem to neglect. The world supports a multi-million-dollar industry of intelligence and ability research, but it devotes virtually nothing to determine why this intelligence is squandered by engaging in amazing, breathtaking acts of stupidity. Some antidotes are explained at the end, in chapter 30. This book is a collection of essays by different authors, with several examples of smart people doing dumb things. This is explained even better by James Wells. In 1986 he published the first edition of Understanding Stupidity, that he further developed in 1990. Like Pitkin and Musil 70 years ago, he finds that stupidity is one of the least understood or discussed subjects in the study of history and culture. James Wells defines the problem quite clearly. Although students of human behavior have pointedly ignored our rampant stupidity, many have made careers by pounding intelligence into the ground. Rooms could be filled with the books written on the topic. No one could even keep up with the scientific literature produced in the field. Yet, as vast as this literature is, it leads to but one overwhelming conclusion: nobody knows what it is. The only thing we know for certain is that whatever intelligence is, it has never been tested on intelligence tests. So even if we are intelligent, we are not intelligent enough to know what intelligence is, so we do not know who and what we are. We cannot really understand ourselves without understanding stupidity, and if we understand stupidity, we will understand ourselves. If it is understandable that so much energy and effort should be devoted to the scientific study of intelligence, it is somewhat bewildering to find the much more common, actually dangerous, and potentially devastating phenomenon of stupidity totally neglected. One could read the entire literature in the social sciences without finding so much as a single reference to it. At best, it is dismissed as the opposite of intelligence, but this just sheds more shade on the topic. Certainly, a matter of this importance deserves a hearing in its own right. We shall see, in other parts of this book, how and why the problem of stupidity is either overlooked or misunderstood or dismissed too easily as just silly. The fact is that, as we take further steps on this subject, we move into uncharted territory. But the exploration can be quite interesting, and it becomes less distressing when we begin to understand how stupidity works and how we can cope with its insidious power. It isn't easy. But comments by many readers, of the Italian printed edition and of the online material that has been developing for 12 years, show that this book is offering some useful insights. The initial chapters are introductory, because some premises need to be explained before we get into the core of the subject. In any case, this book can be read in two ways. From the beginning to the end, or choosing subjects, chapters, according to one's inclinations and curiosities, then exploring the rest from there. A description of the Power of Stupidity is online, stupidity.it, latest printing, Mount Pleasant Press, 2003. James Wells also wrote The Story of Stupidity, A History of Western Idiocy from the Days of Greece to the Present, 1995, extended and revised in following editions, latest printing 2006. It's a series of interesting comments on the ways of being stupid, and, more broadly, on the ways of thinking, in different ages and cultures. Unfortunately now these books are out of print, but both are online in stupidity.net/story2 and some suggestions on how to find printed copies are in gandalf.it/stupid/wells.htm. Chapter 2, Stupidity and Biology. Though it isn't an illness, stupidity spreads like a virus, or, more broadly, multiplies as all living creatures do. But, in a basic biological environment, the stupidity problem doesn't exist. The process is based on the production of an extremely large number of dumb mutants. Only very few, the fittest, survive, and that's it. From that point of view, what we see as catastrophe is just another variation in the natural course of events. Occasional destructive fires are understood by botanists as a necessary, indeed desirable, step in the evolution of a forest. Millions of living creatures that die in the process may disagree, but their opinion is irrelevant. In that perspective, solutions are simple and very effective. If there are too many people, all we need is another plague, or any mass slaughter device that will not interfere too much with the overall environment, that can kill 90% of humankind. The surviving 10%, as soon as they get over the shock, are likely to find the resulting environment quite agreeable. They are also likely to be genetically similar, share specific traits of appearance and attitude. If they all had green hair, pink eyes, and liked rainy weather, they would soon come to consider the extinct people with any other hair or eye color, as well as people that like sunny weather, as rather quaint and inferior. Their moisture-resistant history books would treat most of us as we treat the Neanderthals. The destruction or sterilization of our planet, by man-made nuclear, or chemical, power, or maybe by collision with some wandering rock, would be an irrelevant detail in a cosmic perspective. And, if it happened before the development of space travel and colonization, the disappearance of our species, along with the rest of the terrestrial biosphere, wouldn't cause much of a stir even in our galaxy. But in the particular biological environment that is set by certain species, such as ours, the system is based on the assumption that the environment can, and should, be controlled, and that each individual in our species, and in other species that we protect, should be able to live longer, and more pleasantly, than he or she would in an uncontrolled environment. This needs a particular breed of organized intelligence. Therefore stupidity, at this stage and in this sort of evolutionary environment, is extremely dangerous. Some people seem to think that the decay is beyond repair, that by some awful twist of evolution stupidity has totally prevailed. There are, quite distressingly, many facts that appear to confirm that view. This book is an attempt to understand if and how an extreme catastrophe can be avoided. It could be long and complicated to get into the scientific debate, often pointless, but sometimes enlightening, on the intelligence of biology or the biology of intelligence. One can argue, depending on the point of view, that evolution is intelligent, or stupid. And the same contradictions can be found in the study of human cultures. On this subject there is another interesting observation by James Wells. Archaeology is mainly dedicated to searching for intelligence. That is, what since the origin of our species makes Homo sapiens different from other humanoids that, according to our criteria, appear to have lesser thinking ability. Or, in not so remote times, finding facts that show progress, improvement in technique, science, or social organization. History, on the other hand, is an inexhaustible collection of errors and failures, an endless celebration of the power of stupidity. Another observation by the same author is the ambivalence of cultural heritage. Tradition is a buildup of experience and useful know-how. But it is also sclerotic rigidity of prejudice, superstition, habit, dogmatism, constrictions, obedience, that hinder knowledge and are often the roots of human stupidity. Not only in philosophical and scientific evolution, but also in everyday life, we are often faced with a choice. What must we keep of our knowledge from experience and what should we learn from new stimuli, or from things that we already know, but we haven't yet understood as well as we could? We need to do both, whenever we have an opportunity. There is a lot that we can learn by combining experience with curiosity. Recent studies in paleoanthropology help us to understand that at the origin of our species, in the most primitive human cultures, there were coherent and cohesive social structures. There are values, deeply rooted in human nature, that can quite effectively reduce stupidity and counteract its effects. The problem is how to find them and make them work in the turbulences and complexities of today. It would be far too complicated, very long, and somewhat boring, to get into a discussion on the nature of intelligence. Theoretical debates are endlessly complicated and often inconclusive. But one fact is relevant: it makes no sense to define intelligence as only linear or logic, and it's equally wrong to discard as stupid what doesn't seem to be fully explained by rational thinking. Reason and emotion, logic and intuition can't be separated. Great steps in knowledge, and science, were made by intuitive perceptions that only later found a precise rational explanation. Also daily experience proves that intuition can be faster, and more effective, than too much reasoning. We can be stupid if we allow ourselves to be led only by emotion, but we are not very bright if we think that all problems can be solved following an apparently logical sequence. This is one of the reasons why, at the end of this book, there are some informal observations on how to simplify complexity. Chapter 3. Predictable or unpredictable. One of the reasons why stupidity is dangerous is that it's unpredictable. We shall get to that subject in other parts of this book, specifically in chapters 4, 7, and 30. But there are facts to prove how we can be quite stupid about things that are easily predictable, though we choose to ignore or misunderstand the clear signs of what is going to happen. I have deliberately avoided, in this book, to use specific examples. Because even a superficial collection would fill thousands of pages. Because each case has its own story, its individual diversity. Because for events of the past there can be disagreements in historical explanations, and in many recent situations there are conflicts of opinion, position, or interest. Even when they are well chosen, examples can blur, rather than clarify, the substance of a general statement. But there was one case, as clear as practically harmless, that because of its staggering simplicity, and lack of complex, harmful, or worrying effects, may be worth quoting. It is interesting also because it didn't involve a group of people, or a particular culture, but all of humanity, or, at least, that part of humanity that is aware of the most widely shared calendar and can easily access global information systems, directly or as reflected by local media. 10 years ago, in 1998 and 1999, there was a lot of noise about the end of the millennium. It was generally accepted, with hardly any doubt or perplexity, that the 21st century, and the third millennium, would start on the first day of year 2000. All that fuss is practically forgotten. There are still a few, and often pointless, discussions about the new millennium, but this is no longer a hot subject. So we can be cool and detached in trying to understand why there was an obvious and silly mistake. Few things have ever been as easily predictable as the fact the 20th century, and therefore the second millennium, would come to an end at 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds of January 1, 2001. It's quite bewildering that there was such widespread confusion, with so many ceremonies and celebrations a year ahead of time. It seems that there were meaningless debates on the same mistake 1,000 years earlier, as well as some discussion in 1899 about when the 19th century would come to an end. Many people, who are neither stupid nor ignorant, were quite convinced that the century and the millennium would end at midnight on December 21, 1999. They found it difficult to adjust to obvious arithmetic. After a few minutes of perplexed pondering, they grudgingly admitted, well, maybe, actually there never was a year zero. But they were uncomfortable about having to adjust their thinking. Was this stupid? Maybe not, if we define stupidity by its practical effects, see Chapter 7. The millennium mistake caused a lot of noise, but little harm, and if some people seized the opportunity to celebrate twice, maybe they had some fun. It was disappointing for many sellers of gimmicks and gadgets. Maybe too much confused discussion, as well as doubts about the date, made people bored and uninterested. Lots of things labeled millennium remained on the shelves. Champagne producers sold less than they expected. Travel agents not only had poor results, but also faced some deception claims for selling the wrong date. This comedy of errors wasn't totally harmless, though it didn't cause a great deal of damage. But the worrying fact is that the most absurd idiocies, if repeated often enough, can be widely accepted as truth. How many things that are told as certain are equally false? Another subject, widely discussed 10 years ago, really had its deadline on December 31, 1999. It was the infamous millennium bug, that doesn't worry anyone anymore, though many problems, old and new, are still lurking in technologies. The stupidity, in this case, was very obvious, and quite dangerous. The Gregorian calendar was defined 415 years earlier. It was nonsensical for anyone in the technology business to ignore the fact that electronic systems unable to handle 4-digit year numbers would malfunction. Those systems were conceived in the 60s. But only 1 or 2 years before the deadline did anyone begin to be concerned. After decades of careless lethargy, in which the problem was ignored, things changed abruptly to hysterical, exaggerated alarm, forecasting catastrophes that luckily didn't happen. There are many examples in the history of technologies, old or recent, of problems that could have been easily avoided, or effectively solved, by being a little more careful about what systems were supposed to do. But this is only one of many areas in which there are such blunders. In a much broader sense, it is inconceivable that there could be so much carelessness for so many years, followed by so hasty and confused flutter. How many other problems, now ignored or unmanaged, will become loud and messy fracas when it may be too late? There are very serious problems that were precisely predictable, but have been stupidly ignored or ineffectively handled. One of the obvious examples is the aging of population, that could have been mathematically projected with close approximation 50 years ago. In countries such as Italy it wasn't faced when it would have been less difficult to manage it, and it's still causing more pointless discussion than effective solutions. There is the obnoxious idiocy of continuing to burn fossil fuels, with all sorts of ever-increasing, and more alarming, problems, instead of investing in what is needed to find more intelligent solutions. There is the increase of population, with a growth curve that seems somewhat less steep than was projected some years ago. While no real solution is in sight, there are some gradual improvements, partly due to intelligent developments, mainly cultural awareness. But the forces at play include very stupid and awful perversities, such as diseases, famine, slaughter, wars, and other forms of extreme violence. Another problem that was easily predictable, but was ignored until it became catastrophical, is the so-called financial crisis, that, when this book is going into print, is far from being resolved and isn't even understood in any reasonable way. More comments on this are at the end of chapter 25. Is stupidity growing? Mental blindness, myopia, stupidity are running the world. As seen by an observer in remote space, it could be very funny. But, as an inhabitant of this planet, I am having a hard time trying to find it amusing. Of course these are only a few of many examples that we all can find. Large-scale problems that involve everyone. Or small embarrassments that, taken one by one, may concern only the people directly involved. But, in their infinite quantity, they combine in many ways to multiply, spread and increase the overwhelming power of stupidity. A fact that is clearly proven, but not well enough understood and practiced, is that the most effective solution for birth control is to increase women's education level and independence in decision. Also many other problems could be solved with more widespread knowledge and awareness. Obviously this isn't just about those problems or dangers that are predictable, but aren't prevented before they get worse. Here we are back to the basic notion that stupidity is often unpredictable, or its effects can be felt in unpredicted ways. It helps to be prepared. To understand that nothing ever happens in a totally coherent manner, and not be scared by the unexpected, where there are often problems, but there can also be opportunities. Stupidity is everywhere, but it doesn't always prevail. If we learn to know it better, we can not only limit the damage, but sometimes even reverse the process, finding some sparkle of intelligence in what appeared to be a dismaying wasteland of stupidity. Chapter 4, Murphy's Law. A well-known fact, closely connected to human stupidity, is that often things don't work. We shall discuss some interesting observations on this subject in the next 2 chapters. But let's start with the most popular definition of this problem. It's called Murphy's Law, and it has been repeated and quoted widely for 60 years. Of course it was true, and largely confirmed by facts, thousands of years ago. But with confused culture, clumsy government, hasty and nearsighted management, financial gambling, and messy technologies, its effects tend to multiply. It was never stated as a scientific law. It's just a saying, and it's often supposed to be funny. But it's worth taking quite seriously. There are conflicting theories about how it started, but for the sake of these considerations let's assume that it was a comment by an Air Force technical officer, Captain Edward Murphy, in 1949, in a specific case of human stupidity. Someone had risked his life because some instrument hadn't been set correctly. Whatever the origin, or the occasion from which it was born, the fact is that it has become proverbial. If something can go wrong, it will, at the worst possible time. On Murphy's Law there is a vast literature, often amusing, with countless variants and corollaries. Many are just funny, but some are practically relevant, applied to different situations and all sorts of activities, but generally with the same basic meaning. The same concept is defined in a variety of sayings, such as Sod's Law, or Finagle's Law as mentioned in a footnote in Chapter 1. Flanagan's precept says that both Murphy and Finagle were incurable optimists. There are many collections and anthologies. Some are online, such as Murphy's Laws and Corollaries. Joking on the subject can be fun, and maybe we can be lucky. Things don't always go wrong. But it's a real problem that they do, and that isn't just grumbling by Murphy or whoever is saying the same thing. It's the wisdom of knowing how things happen, and being prepared for unexpected glitches. Sometimes things can go surprisingly better. But it would be stupid to expect them to counterbalance those that go worse. Countless variations on Murphy's Law don't tell us why things go wrong. Often the mess is so malicious that it seems to be the work of some mischievous gremlin. But it's pretty clear that the most frequent origin is human stupidity. It can be our own stupidity, because we have made a mistake, we haven't checked as carefully as we should, or we have failed to consider a variable whose effects come into play when we least expect them. Or it can be someone else's stupidity. Someone near to us, who has done something wrong, or is making things unnecessarily complicated. Or maybe someone, we may not know who, how or where, somehow caused us to have wrong or misleading information, or designed a tool that breaks down at the worst possible time. Murphy's Law, if properly understood, is a resource for intelligence. The point is that the unexpected is practically unavoidable. Because we are never able to control all variables. Or because some external factors, that we can't control, come into play when they are least expected. There are several ways of coping with this problem so that we are not taken by total surprise. One is to have an effective backup of solutions that can replace the one that suddenly isn't working. Another is flexible planning, that treats the unexpected not as an obstacle, but as a different route to the objective, or maybe the opening of a new opportunity. Above all, it's important to know that the unexpected exists, and be mentally prepared to face it. Not to be confused or scared, but to be ready to find new solutions, to meet new opportunities, to learn from the stimulating experience of change. An interesting, but rarely understood, corollary to Murphy's Law is that, if a problem has a way of solving itself, it will do so when there is a state of alarm, several actions are in place to try to fix it, etc. One of the consequences of this fact, more often than it may seem, is that in some situations the best solution is to wait and see without making any move, but of course it's difficult to know beforehand in which circumstances this may be the most effective behavior. See Chapter 19 The Stupidity of Technologies, or online gandalf.it/offline/studch.htm. It helps to know that this sort of thing can happen quite often, and be ready to cancel the alarm before the remedies turn out to be worse than the disease or cause unnecessary panic, confusion, and complications. And, above all, in such cases and in any other difficult circumstance, to be willing to admit I made a mistake. Insisting on errors, or false alarms, is a dangerous form of stupidity. So Murphy's Law is a serious concern, but not a reason for despair or giving up. Quite to the contrary, it's a tool for knowledge, and for effective planning, management, and behavior. If we pretend, or assume, that there are infallible or totally reliable technologies, methods, or plans, we are heading for bitter, sometimes catastrophic, surprises. As Douglas Adams explained, the major difference between a thing that might go wrong and a thing that cannot possibly go wrong is that when a thing that cannot possibly go wrong goes wrong, it usually turns out to be impossible to get at or repair. If in any large or small project, making coffee, organizing a journey or building a dam, we consider the unavoidable Murphy phenomena, we can organize it with the appropriate flexibility, consider the mistakes and the unexpected circumstances as likely variants and not unmanageable mishaps. So we can reduce anxiety, improve quality, and avoid the awful mess that is generated by the unexpected and multiplies all sorts of mistakes. Let's be grateful to Edward Murphy, or whoever else is the real author of the law, and let's try to make good use of his bright observation, as often as possible, in everything we do. We shall get better results and, at the same time, a considerable improvement in quality of life. Chapter 5, Parkinson's Law. While there has always been scarce depth of thinking on the problem of stupidity, there are some remarkably good studies about why things go wrong. One of the most interesting is Parkinson's Law, The Pursuit of Progress by Cyril Northcote Parkinson. This classic was published in 1957, and 50 years later it's even more relevant. It's essentially serious, but it's also amusing. This is one of those rare and unusual books that discuss a complex subject with lucid simplicity and with a refreshing sense of humor. It includes illustrations by Osbert Lancaster, in other editions, by Robert Osborne, that aren't just entertaining or funny, they pleasantly help to understand the meaning of the text, while they are irksome for bureaucrats and pedantics. In spite of its success, it was, and it still is, an uncomfortable book, often disregarded by management theorists, ignored or forgotten by people running organizations. The reason is obvious. It says too many embarrassing truths, and, that is even more irritating, it does so in plain and brilliantly readable English. It was disturbing and distressing when it was first published. It is even more so today. It was originally published as an article in The Economist in November 1955, and expanded to become a book in 1957. It was reprinted many times, until 2002, but now it seems to be out of print, though copies can be found in libraries and in the second-hand market. Several other books by Parkinson were published, developing some specific concepts and subsidiary laws. Parts of the book are summarized in www.vdare.com/pb/Parkinson_review.htm. Some explanations are online, such as www.adstockweb.com/businesslore/Parkinsons_law.htm. Parkinson's law is generally quoted as work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. But this book also explains why organizations grow, regardless of any increase or decrease of what they are supposed to do, as a result of hierarchic mechanisms and functional anomalies. 50 years ago it was mostly a case of structures growing, with increasingly complicated internal relations. Parkinson explained that an organization of 1,000 people can use all of its time and resources communicating only with itself, without generating anything worthwhile for the outside world. Nowadays those problems still remain, while there are additional complications in the opposite direction. Personnel cuts are often a rough and brutal short-term tool to increase profit, and it's even more so with mergers and acquisitions. The size of organizations decreases for non-functional reasons, and quite often this is done without reducing the overstaffing in useless or cumbersome roles. This bizarre combination of bulimia and anorexia is one of the most serious diseases in all sort of organizations, business, government, politics, private or public service. The bigger they are, the worse it gets. The basic problem is that an organization, like a living organism, is driven by an urge to grow and reproduce itself. But while life, as such, has value for the sheer sake of existing, this is not so for business enterprises, or any other public or private organizations, that deserve to exist only if they are doing something useful for someone else, and for society as a whole. Growing, if and when there is a need for more of what they are doing, or shrinking when their usefulness decreases, disappearing if they no longer serve a purpose. This is a constant in all human ventures, regardless of whether they are for profit or for other purposes, such as institutional, political, or public service. Another of Parkinson's observations is that the amount of time and attention spent by management on a problem is in inverse proportion to its real importance. This can't be taken as a general rule, and it isn't always so. But anyone familiar with how organizations really work knows that it happens quite often. There is also a disease called the law of delay. 3. When a problem is urgent, serious, taxing, and complex, the people in charge avoid responsibility by delegating and delaying, doubting and hesitating, fussing and discussing, postponing and dismissing, until it's beyond repair. In the state of exaggerated and paranoid haste in which we are living, as we shall see in chapter 16, it may seem that delay is no longer a problem. But the fact is that it's as bad as ever, and often getting worse. This is also known as the law of triviality. The time spent on any item of a committee's agenda will be in inverse proportion to the sum of money involved. The Law of Delay, with other comments by C. Northcote Parkinson, was published as a separate book in 1970. Imaginary urgency and haste with no reason often lead to setting aside whatever doesn't appear to have an immediate solution. The result is the combination of two mistakes: deciding in a hurry on things that needed more thinking, while putting off decisions that it would have been better to take at the right time. The resulting confusion leads to more blundering haste, combined with a confusing buildup of problems that wouldn't be there if they had been handled properly at the right time. This isn't only an unmanageable mess, it's also a never-ending vicious circle that makes things even worse. We have already seen several disasters caused by this syndrome. But the fact is that decision systems are decaying in many organizations while they appear to survive, and their collapse will come as a surprise if we continue to ignore the termites of mismanagement that are lurking inside them. Another disease explained by Parkinson is called ingelatance, the rise to authority of individuals with unusually high combinations of incompetence and jealousy. The ingelatant individual is recognizable from the persistence with which he struggles to eject all those abler than himself. This isn't new, it has been causing all sorts of problems since the origins of human society, and it's proliferating in the complexities of the world as it is now. There are two closely related subjects: the rise of incompetence, as explained by the Peter Principle in the next pages, chapter 6, and the stupidity of power, as we shall see in chapter 10. Stupidity is not mentioned, as such, in Parkinson's law and in other analyses of why things go wrong. But it's pretty obvious that those destructive behaviors are stupid, and it's even more stupid that, 50 years after they were so clearly diagnosed, they continue to happen, with added complications making them worse. Chapter 6, The Peter Principle. Another basic text on organization problems, or, as the author called it, the salutary science of hierarchiology, is the Peter Principle, Why Things Always Go Wrong, published in 1969 by a Canadian sociologist, Lawrence Peter. After the success of this book, he wrote 3 more on the same subject, expanding the concept and also, ironically but not unreasonably, suggesting solutions. 40 years later, his observations are still as useful as they were. Not only for studies of hierarchiology and organization diseases, but also for all people who wish to have a better perspective in their work and life. As well as, of course, whoever is trying to understand human stupidity. The Peter Principle is so widely known that it is included in dictionaries as part of the English language. But, proverbial as it may be, it is poorly understood, and even less applied, in the practical running of organizations. Peter's books, like Parkinson's, combine an intriguing sense of humor with sound and serious thinking. They are as much fun to read as they are thoughtful, interesting, and useful. The Peter Principle says that people in an organization, if it's driven by meritocracy, will advance to their highest level of competence and then be promoted to, and remain at, a level at which they are incompetent. When they are good at doing something, they are moved to something else, for which they are inadequate or unqualified. It's mentioned in many collections of quotations, with added variations and corollaries. It has been included, with hardly any practical effects, in some business administration teaching. In 1981 there was a board game called the Peter Principle game. From 1995 to 2000 the Peter Principle was a television show, a BBC situation comedy, etc. Though this sounds a bit simplistic, it can be summarized as the cream rises until it sours. But while sour cream can be quite tasty, and healthy, this sort of rising is a recipe for poison. It happens that a person, who isn't stupid in a specific task, is moved to a situation where he or she becomes stupid, not in a general sense, but because of incompetence in a new role. The result, as such moves multiply, is a continuing growth of incompetence, or incompetence, at all levels in the organization. And the competent people, who haven't yet been promoted to their level of incompetence, are hindered in their work by reporting to those that are already there. In one of his books, The Peter Prescription, in 1974, Lawrence Peter re-examined the problem and suggested solutions, that of course are humorous, but may have some uncanny practical value. For instance, he suggests that, when someone is getting close to the risk of incompetence, the way out could be some whimsical or unconventional behavior, disturbing enough to avoid promotion, but not so serious as to risk being fired, or demoted. And so remain happily in the right place. Is it a joke? Yes. But it could actually work, and some lucky people enjoying their jobs may have done so without even being aware of it. Is this why many of the best people in all sorts of places have unusual, and often quite interesting, personalities? There can be other complications in the reasons why people may want to refuse, or avoid, promotion. They may be afraid of, or embarrassed by, co-workers' jealousy. This is almost a reverse case of incompetence as discussed in the context of Parkinson's Law, Chapter 5. There are also people who simply don't want to be burdened with responsibility. That can be, according to the circumstances, wisdom or cowardice. But it has little, if anything, to do with the Peter Principle and with why things go wrong. Peter's teachings are often ignored, not only because they are uncomfortable, but also because people at the top of organizations don't like to be told that they have been wrong in promoting their staff, or, even worse, that they are the ones who have reached the fatal level of incompetence. This is sometimes, rather improperly, quoted as Peter's rule for creative incompetence. Create the impression that you have already reached your level of incompetence. But that would be destructive, encouraging people to deliberately do bad work. In addition to a depressing decrease in job satisfaction, such behavior could lead to worse than not being promoted. A peculiar case is that of so-called innovation. In many businesses the most competent people were placed in traditional areas, where competition was more aggressive, while it was felt that in innovative sectors growth would be so fast that it would take care of everything, and as, anyhow, nobody really knew what was going on, they could be managed by less reliable people. In February 2000 I wrote a short article on this subject, Do Androids Dream of Electric Money? Gandalf.it/offline/androids.htm. If someone thinks that I was mimicking Philip Dick, yes, of course, I was. Have things changed much in following years? Not really. In some ways, they are getting worse. On the stupidity of technologies, and of the way they are understood and used, see Chapter 19. The Peter Principle has generated a number of corollaries and variations. Such as the Dilbert Principle by Scott Adams, 1996, the least competent, least smart people are promoted to where they can do the least damage, management. A few years ago there were quotations of something called the Natreb Principle, but it seems to have faded into oblivion. It said that people gravitate to the professions where their incompetence is most obvious, or every profession attracts the least fit. That, of course, is an exaggeration. But things of this sort are happening on a distressing scale. The real question is, why are tasks, including some very important ones, assigned to people who are inept for the purpose? The situation today is worse than it was when Lawrence Peter defined his principle. The concept of merit is more and more confused. People are promoted, or chosen, because of protection by oligarchic power, superficial appearance, intrigue, and other reasons that have little, if anything, to do with competence. Incompetence is promoted also by the overwhelming dominance of financial manipulation that rewards cunning trickery, or maybe a stroke of luck in riding the tide when the stock market is driven by a twist in large-scale gambling. The results are quite dismal for whoever is left with the task of picking up the pieces and trying to put Humpty together again. But in the meantime the lucky gamblers, when they don't simply run away with the money, can be promoted far beyond their ability to manage a business or produce results in a real market. To try to solve high-level incompetence problems, some management consultants are suggesting quaintly named maneuvers, such as percussive sublimation or lateral arabesque, that can be boiled down to an old notion, Much more clearly defined in Latin, promovetur ut amovetur. Incompetent people at the top, or high in the hierarchy, are moved up, or laterally, to roles of mere appearance, so that actual management can be left in the hands of those who have not yet been promoted above their competence. But this sort of expedient is only one of several reasons why stupid people are in important and highly visible roles. They are often placed at the top of the hierarchy by criteria that have little to do with merit and competence. There are cases, unfortunately not uncommon, that go beyond the Peter principle, such as promoting to a higher level people who were already incompetent in the role they had. Another problem is the impact of mergers, acquisitions, and concentrations, causing the loss of corporate cultures that had led companies to success, destroying their competence, expertise, and dedication in doing something better than anyone else. Many people are removed not because they are incompetent, but because in two or more merging structures there are duplicate roles, and also because part of the cost of acquisitions is recovered by cutting staff. In the steaming cauldron of the mixed-up organization, roles overlap and interfere with each other. Rewards don't go to the best qualified people, but to those supported by the winning faction. Power games and office intrigue prevail on merit and quality. The best people, if they survive the ordeal, are often moved to roles in which they are less effective, and anyhow they are demotivated by an environment that doesn't reward good work. Appearance is worth more than substance, competence doesn't matter, the name of the game is struggling to stay afloat in murky waters. This is how the Peter principle combines with other diseases in the hierarchy game to increase and multiply the power of human stupidity. Chapter 7, Chipala's Laws. One of the most interesting essays ever written about stupidity can be amusing because of its tongue-in-cheek, ironic style, but it's better to take it quite seriously, because the subject isn't funny. It's called The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity. It was written originally in English, over 30 years ago, by Carlo M. Chipala, Professor Emeritus of Economic History at Berkeley. But it was practically unknown to the general public until it was included, in Italian, in a book that was published in 1988. Unfortunately, the English text is not publicly available. Some of Carlo Chipala's observations, bright as they are, confirm existing knowledge and general common sense. Such as the fact that the size of the problem, or the number of stupid people, in all human categories and societies, is generally and broadly underestimated. This is something that we can all notice everywhere and every day. Aware as we may be of the overwhelming power of stupidity, we are quite often surprised by its surfacing when and where we least expect it. Carlo M. Chipala, Allegro ma non troppo, Il Mulino, Bologna, 1988, Italian translation by Anna Parrish. The Basic Laws of Human Stupidity are in the last 37 pages. In 2001 that book was published in Spanish and Portuguese, but not in English. Chipala's essay on stupidity was written in the early 70s and circulated privately by photocopy. In 1976 it was printed in a thin booklet as a Christmas gift to a few colleagues and friends. In 1987 it was published by the Whole Earth Review, apparently without the author's agreement. In 2002 the original English text was online, in Ecotopia and other websites. But suddenly, in 2006, the copyright owners decided to prohibit its publication everywhere, including the internet. And so it became, again, unavailable. That's a pity. But, alas, that's the law. Sometimes it reappears in different places online, but I can't say where, because it's illegal, and, by the time this book is printed, it may have vanished again. Chipala's first law: always and inevitably everyone underestimates the number of stupid individuals in circulation, page 45 in the Italian edition. Two consequences are pretty obvious in any analysis of the problem. One is that we often underestimate the awful effects of stupidity. The other is that, because it is so unpredictable, stupid behavior is more dangerous than intentional mischief for, as was clearly summarized by Robert Heinlein in Hanlon's Razor, see Chapter 1. What is missing in this perspective, as in the case of Walter Pitkin and almost every author dealing with this subject, is a consideration of our stupidity, or, in any case, of the stupidity factor that exists even in the most intelligent people. See Chapter 9 for more comments on this subject. One of the key notions in Carlo Chipala's theory, as well as in the studies by James Wells, is that a person's stupidity is independent of any other characteristic of that person. In other words, stupidity is equally shared by all humanity. This is a basic point, that may contradict some widespread opinions, but it's confirmed by any careful analysis of the problem. This isn't just some bland, superficial way of being politically correct. It is substantially true that no human category is more intelligent, or more stupid, than another. There is no difference in the level and frequency of stupidity by gender, age, race, color, ethnic background, culture, education, etc. Ignorance may be influenced by stupidity, or vice versa, but they are not the same thing, see Chapter 13. There is a concept, in Chipala's theory, that I have adopted as a method in some of my analyses. It's defined in his third, and golden, law: a stupid person is a person who causes losses to another person or to a group of persons while himself deriving no gain and even possibly incurring losses. An important advantage of this approach is that it avoids the thorny problem of trying to find, in theory, a definition of stupidity, or intelligence, while it evaluates its relevance in relation to practical effects. It's pretty clear that, with this criterion, different categories of behavior can be defined. At one extreme we find people who do good for themselves as well as for others, therefore we call them intelligent. At the other end of the spectrum there are people who do harm to themselves as well as to others, and those are stupid. Obviously there are at least two in-between categories. One that harms others while gaining self-advantage, Chipala calls them bandits. And one where we place people who harm themselves while doing good for others. Chipala's fourth law, non-stupid people always underestimate the damaging power of stupid individuals. In particular, non-stupid people constantly forget that at all times and places and under any circumstances to deal and / or associate with stupid people always turns out to be a costly mistake, ed. Page 72. Chipala's fifth law, a stupid person is the most dangerous type of person, with the corollary a stupid person is more dangerous than a bandit, ed. Page 73. Chipala's second law, the probability that a certain person be stupid is independent of any other characteristic of that person, ed. Page 48. This is the central focus of Chipala's theory, ed. Page 58. The definition of this last category isn't as simple as it may seem. It isn't always appropriate to call them hapless or hopeless. That approach may seem correct if gain or loss are measured according to simplistic criteria of classic economy. But it can be wrong when applied to people who deliberately sacrifice some of their own benefits for the good of others, as explained in the next few pages, Chapter 8. The most useful concept in Carlo Chipala's approach is the definition of stupidity and intelligence, based on the results of human behavior, not on difficult and questionable theories. We shall see in the next two chapters some practical results of this method, as well as the reasons why some of the criteria that I am following in the development of this subject are different from those indicated by his laws. I am deliberately avoiding any attempt to offer a formal definition of stupidity. We can be quite precise on the subject by discussing how stupidity relates with other behaviors, as well as what it does, how it works, the nature of its causes and effects, the ways in which it can be understood and its hideous influence can be prevented or reduced. However, for those who are interested, there is a definition, by James Wells, that fits the purpose better than any other I have ever read. It's online, with my comments, gandalf.it/stupid/defining.pdf. Essentially, it points to a key fact: the problem of stupidity is basically connected with information, communication, and knowledge. The basic tools to control it are listening, curiosity, and doubt. As we shall see in the next chapters, especially at the end, in Antidotes and Prevention. Chapter 8, the Stupidology Graph. When stupidity and intelligence, or other human behaviors, are defined by their practical effects, obviously the estimated data, or hypotheses, can be charted quite simply, and effectively, by using the classic, two-dimensional, Cartesian coordinate system. Of course, not all results can be measured as numbers, but a calculated guess, if appropriately defined, can be enough to draw a picture. It is standard procedure to define four quadrants numbered counterclockwise from I to 4. If we place on the horizontal, abscissa, x-axis the advantage, or disadvantage, that someone obtains from his or her own actions, and on the vertical, ordinate, y-axis the effects on other people, any one of us can find a position, based on the practical consequences of behavior, where a person, or group of people, is to be placed. It's obvious that behaviors in quadrant I, top right, are at various levels of intelligence, while in quadrant 3, bottom left, it's stupidity. It is also obvious that in the fourth quadrant, bottom right, we can find different levels of banditism. But those in the second, top left, can't be so easily defined. These people may be hapless or hopeless if and when they harm themselves and others without being aware of what they are doing. But the same placement in the coordinates could be the result of deliberately generous or altruistic behavior. In such cases, the analysis could take one of two courses. Consider moral and social benefits, and therefore place those behaviors in the intelligent area. Or leave them where they are, on the left of the y-axis, but use a different definition, more on this subject in Chapter 11. Without getting into the details, that could be quite complex, of what can be done with this sort of analyses. A key fact is that the evaluation of different behaviors can be done on an individual basis, one-to-one, or on a wider scale, involving large systems, nations, international communities, or even humanity as a whole, or not so wide environments, local situations, companies, associations, organized or informal groups, human communities of any sort, nature, or size. The system, as a whole, can improve or degrade as the result of a combination of several different behaviors, not all necessarily altruistic. But it's clear that the greatest improvement is the result of intelligent action, and the worst deterioration is caused by stupidity. In other words, if each person or group of people mind too much their own interest, and don't consider the effect of their actions on everyone else, there is a general decay of society as a whole, and so also those who thought they were being smart turn out to be stupid. But it often happens that this is understood when it's too late. This confirms the basic concept: the most dangerous factor in every human society is stupidity. Of course, there are specific, and often dramatic, consequences when there is an unbalance of cause and effect, as in the case of actions by a few people that have an effect on many. For more on this subject, see Chapter 10, The Stupidity of Power. In the use of the coordinates, there are some differences between the approach suggested by Carlo Chipala and the method in my reasoning. They are mainly three. Observations by Chipala, as well as Walter Pitkin and nearly everybody considering this subject, are based on an assumption of total separation: some people are intelligent and some are stupid. As we shall see more specifically in the next chapter, I believe that almost nobody is totally stupid, and nobody can hope to be always intelligent. Therefore we need to consider the element of stupidity, and also of other behavior patterns, that exists in all of us. Analyses based on results can be made by trying to define a person's general behavior pattern or be limited to a particular set of circumstances. This second option is not to be excluded. It can be quite interesting to find how the same person, in different roles or situations, can behave in ways that lead to different results and definitions. Each one of us can be more often stupid in some sorts of circumstances, less so in others. It can be useful to try to understand which environments, or types of activity, are more likely to influence the behavior of a certain person, or our own. And so, as far as possible, to prevent the same problems from happening too often, or, at least, to be better aware of when and how those mistakes are likely to happen. It isn't less relevant to understand that stupid results can happen quite often outside of any verified or assumed usual pattern of personal attitude and behavior. This can help us to remember how and why stupidity can be unpredictable. Luckily we see, sometimes, unexpected intelligent results. It can be useful to understand how and why they occur, but it's better if we don't count on them, because they never happen often enough. The obvious attitude is to place ourselves in the x-axis and someone else in the y. But it can be very useful to do it the other way round, tracing the effects of our actions on other people. The difficulty lies in the fact that, of course, the quality of results is to be measured by the point of view of whoever is at the receiving end. But it's always a useful exercise to try to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, especially when we are trying to measure our level of stupidity, or intelligence. Of course everyone can, depending on the circumstances, choose the criteria in drawing a stupidity graph. It's quite easy to do it with a computer graph or a spreadsheet, but it isn't necessary. It's enough to draw two crossing lines on any piece of paper, or use squared paper to mark the numerical indexes. It isn't always possible to have reliable data to measure the results of someone's behavior. But precise figures are not indispensable. The use of perceived values, even if they are hypothetical or vaguely estimated, can have a relevant meaning. Some readers find the use of Cartesian coordinates interesting, intriguing and amusing, while others think it's obscure and boring. That isn't a problem. All of the reasoning can be understood without ever reading or drawing a graph. And this applies also to the 5 diagrams in Chapter 11, where they are added to visualize trends, but concepts are fully explained in the text. A description of the book is online, stupidity.it or area of incompetence, as explained in Chapter 6. Chapter 9, Tree Corollaries. A pretty obvious fact is that responsible and generous people are generally aware of how they behave, malicious and nasty people understand what they are doing, and even the weakest victims have a feeling that something isn't quite right, but stupid people don't know they are stupid, and that this is one more reason why they are extremely dangerous. This is generally well understood by anyone trying to look into the uncomfortable problem of human stupidity. But it's quite alarming. And this, of course, leads me back to my original, agonizing question, am I stupid? I have passed IQ tests with good marks. Unfortunately, I know that they don't prove anything. Several people have told me that I am intelligent, or so they think. But that this doesn't prove anything, either. They may simply be too kind to tell me the truth. Conversely, they could be attempting to use my stupidity for their own advantage. Or they could be just as stupid as I am. I have one little glimpse of hope. Quite often, I am intensely aware of how stupid I am, or I have been. And this indicates that I am not completely stupid. At times, I have tried to locate myself in the Cartesian coordinates, see Chapter 8, using as far as possible measurable results of action, rather than opinion, as a yardstick. Depending on the situation, I seem to wander around the upper side of the graph, above the x-axis, sometimes in the quadrant on the top right, that is to say, with a relatively low or high level of intelligence. But in some cases I am desperately lost on the left side, hurting myself as well as others. I just hope I am useful to others as often as I think. But I know that it's impossible to never make mistakes, and that there is never any end to learning. On a broader scale, one would expect the strongest success factors to lie in the first and fourth quadrant, that is, on the right side of the y-axis. However, the staggering number of people who belong on the other side, and have wonderful careers, can be only explained by a strong desire on the part of several leaders to be surrounded by as many stupid people as possible, see Chapters 6 and 10. The problem isn't just how to place ourselves in the graph, but also to understand how our stupidity can interact with that of others. Since the remote origins of human thinking, practically everybody, including some of the best writers on the subject, appear to believe that there is a neat separation. People are either intelligent or stupid. But, embarrassing as this can be, it's pretty obvious that it isn't so simple. Shortly after reading his essay on human stupidity, I wrote a letter to Carlo Cipolla. Much to my surprise, he answered, briefly but kindly. I had asked him, what do you think of my corollary to your theory? The answer was well, why not, maybe. Which I think can be taken as agreement on, or, at least, no objection to, a concept that has a strong influence on how we understand the problem of human stupidity. Liberagi's first corollary: one in each of us there is a factor of stupidity, which is always larger than we suppose. This inside factor in each person creates a three-dimensional coordinate system, and I don't think I have to explain its complexity, because no stupid, or timid, person would have had the courage to read this far. Of course, in addition to our own and other people's stupidity, we can introduce other variables, such as our behavior factors, and there are many ways of combining with those of others. It may be wise to forget the intelligent factor, as there never is enough of that, but to consider fourth quadrant values, because even the most generous person can sometimes behave like a bandit, if only by mistake. These additional factors generate multidimensional models that can get fairly difficult to manage. But even if we consider only our individual stupidity values, the complexity can become quite staggering. Try it for yourself, and get really scared. This corollary isn't necessarily related to a single author. It could be applied to Chipala's first basic law, see Chapter 7, or to Hanlon's razor or Finagle's law, Chapter 1, or Murphy's law, Chapter 4, as to any general consideration on the ubiquity of stupidity, that is often, if not always, more widespread and more dangerous than expected. When this concept started to develop, in the early stages of studying the problem of stupidity, it had taken shape in my mind as the first corollary. This sounded rather strange, as I had only one. But my original feeling was right. I have since discovered that there are at least three. Second corollary, when the stupidity of one person combines with the stupidity of others, the impact grows geometrically, i.e. by multiplication, not addition, of the individual stupidity factors. It is a generally accepted concept that the sum of a network increases as the square of the number of members, and it seems quite obvious that the same criterion applies to the combination of stupidity factors in individual people. This can help to explain the well-known fact that crowds as a whole are much more stupid than any individual person in the crowd. Too stupid behavior and thinking tend to reproduce and multiply so dangerously that the contagion can spread to otherwise intelligent people when they don't realize how they are influenced by collective stupidity. Stupidity, as an aggregate, has more consistency and continuity than other human attitudes. But obviously the picture is more complicated, and the consequences even more worrying, if we consider that nobody is totally immune. Third corollary, the combination of intelligence in different people is more difficult than the combination of stupidity. This isn't only because the power of stupidity is generally underestimated, and its consequences are often unpredictable. There are multiple and complicated causes of this problem. Stupidity is brainless, it doesn't need to think, get organized, or plan ahead to generate a combined effect. The transfer and combination of intelligence is a much more complex process. Stupid people can combine instantly into a super stupid group or mass, while intelligent people are effective as a group only when they know each other well and are experienced in working together. The creation of well-tuned groups of people sharing intelligence can generate fairly powerful anti-stupidity forces, but, unlike stupidity bundling, they need organized planning and upkeep, and can lose a large part of their effectiveness by the infiltration of stupid people or unexpected bursts of stupidity in otherwise intelligent people. This can happen in crowds or mobs as well as in organized systems. A classic Latin saying is senators boni viri, senatus mala bestia. We can have doubts now, as there were then, about senators being good men, but even when they are, the assembly as a whole is often more stupid than its individual members. On the problems of organization, see Parkinson's law and the Peter principle in chapters 5 and 6. In some situations these dangers can be partly offset, if not totally controlled, by being aware of the potential problem before anything goes wrong, and having backup intelligence in the group, and in whatever equipment is being used, to fill the gaps, organize the resources and correct the mistakes before the damage becomes too serious. Any good skipper of a sailboat knows what I mean, so does any other person that has experience of an environment where the cause-effect process is bluntly direct and tangible. Communities and organizations with a high intelligence factor are likely to have greater opportunities for long-term survival, but for this to be effective we must avoid the potentially devastating short-term impact of shared stupidity, which, unfortunately, can cause major damage to large numbers of non-stupid people before it self-destructs. For another dangerous element in the equation is that, as we shall see in Chapter 10, the machinery of power tends to place at the top of the pyramid people who care more about their own advantage, and the interests of restricted groups, than about the well-being of everyone else, and they, in turn, tend to favor and protect stupidity and keep true intelligence out of their way as much as they can. While the power of stupidity is insidious and dangerous in all its ways, even more harm is caused by the stupidity of power. Chapter 10, The Stupidity of Power. The stupidity of every single human being is a large enough problem, with all sorts of consequences that aren't easily identified. But the picture changes when we consider the stupidity of people who have power, that is, control over the destiny of other people. Also in this case, I shall continue to follow the concept of defining stupidity, intelligence, etc. by the effects of human behavior. But there is a substantial difference, an unbalance, when the relationship is not of equals. One person, or a small group of people, can influence the life and well-being of many more. This changes the size, the impact, and the nature of all the cause and effect relations in the system. Power, large or small power, is everywhere. We are all subject to someone else's power. And, except perhaps in the case of extreme slavery, we all exert power on others. Personally, I loathe the concept, but, whether we like it or not, it's part of life. Parents have, or are supposed to have, power over their children, but children have a great deal of power over their parents, which they often use quite ruthlessly. We may be owners of cats and dogs, horses or hamsters, elephants or camels, sailboats or cars, phones or computers, but quite often we are subject to their power. It would be far too complicated, for the sake of this subject, to get into the multiple intricacies of human relations. Therefore I shall concentrate on the most obvious cases of power, those situations where someone has a defined role of authority over a large, or small, number of people. In theory, we all tend to agree that there should be as little power as possible, and that people in power should be subject to control by the rest of the people. We call this democracy. Or, in organizations, we can call it leadership, motivation, distributed responsibility, sharing, and personal empowerment, as opposed to authority, bureaucracy, centralization or formal discipline. But there are relatively few people who want real freedom. Responsibility is a burden. Many find it quite convenient to be followers. To let rulers, bosses, managers, opinion leaders, all sorts of gurus or celebrities, movie stars, and television personalities set the pace and, we suppose, do the thinking, and put the blame on them if we're unhappy. On the other hand, there is a somewhat special breed of people who enjoy power. Because they are so dedicated to the substantial effort needed to gain a lot of power, they prevail. We must assume that the general concept applies. There are just as many stupid people in power as there are in the rest of humanity, and there are always more than we think. But two things are different, the relationship and the attitude. The power of power people in power are more powerful than other people. It isn't as obvious as it sounds. One might argue that this is not always so. There are apparently powerful people with less real influence than some who are much less visible. Without getting into the complexities of this difference, it's worth noting that there is a widespread bizarre and stupid behavior. There are many people who go out of their way to be followers of apparent power, and so are actively committed to the advantage of others while damaging themselves. Regardless of how and why power is held and used, and of appearances that often confuse roles, this is about real power. The uneven relationship caused by the fact that some people have a stronger influence on circumstances than others, and in many situations a few people can do good or harm to many. A basic, and quite obvious, criterion is that the effect of behavior must be measured not by the yardstick of whoever does something, but from the other end the point of view of whoever is subject to the effects of that person's acts, or lack of action. A clear result of this basic concept is a drastic shift in the stupidology diagram, as we shall see in chapter 11. The harm, or good, is much larger, depending on the number of people involved and the impact of actions and decisions. What appears as a detail in the ivory tower of power can be very important in the lives of ordinary people. If a person in a hypothetical equal relationship, as we have seen in chapter 8, gains as much personal advantage as the damage it causes to someone else, the system as a whole remains balanced. But it's obviously not so when there is a difference in power. In abstract theory, we could assume that, as the percentage of intelligent or stupid people is the same, the effect of power will be balanced. That hypothesis may be relatively close to reality in a few small power situations, in narrow environments where personal interaction is direct and mutually effective. But when power deals with large numbers of people, the one-to-one relationship is lost. It is much more difficult to listen, to understand, to measure the consequences and the perceptions. There is a Doppler effect, a shift, leading to an increase of the stupidity factor. Even in open, democratic societies, where power isn't isolated and remote, information is freely available, elected representatives are supposed to act on behalf of the people and their actions are, or should, be open to public scrutiny. The relationship is not of equals. All serious studies of power systems, while they are not necessarily based on the notion that power is stupid, point to the need for power separation, and for power conflicts to be formalized so that they don't lead to violence, in order to avoid absolute power, i.e. extreme stupidity. That's a big enough problem to keep us all on constant alert against any exaggerated concentration of power, and to explain why so many things aren't working as well as they should. But there is more. This is one of the problems of idolatry, as explained in chapter 22. The power syndrome. How do people gain power? Sometimes by not even trying. They are entrusted by other people, because other people trust them. They have natural leadership and a sense of responsibility. This process, more often than not, produces intelligent power. A situation in which the chosen leaders do good for themselves, and a lot more for others. Sometimes it can lead to deliberate sacrifice, when people do harm to themselves for the benefit of others. If that is done intentionally, it doesn't fall into the hapless category because of the moral good, including self-perception and the approval of others, gained by the person who deliberately places common good over private interest. But there are much fewer examples of such intelligent power than we would all like to see. Why? The reason is that there is competition for gaining and maintaining power. An aggressive, sometimes fearsome, often anxious, always troubled, craving for power. The people who don't seek power per se, but are more concentrated on their responsibilities in doing good for others, have less time and energy to spend on gaining more power, or even holding on to what they have. Those who have a greed for power, regardless of its impact on society, concentrate on the struggle for power. Most individuals are placed somewhere between the two extremes of that spectrum, responsibility or power-mongering, with many different shades and nuances. But the manipulating element is the most aggressive in the power game, and therefore it gains more power. Even people with the most generous initial motivation can be forced, over time, to dedicate more energy to maintaining or increasing power, to the point of losing sight of their original objectives. Another element, that makes things worse, is megalomania. Power is an addictive drug. People in power are often led to believe that because they have power they are better, smarter, wiser, than ordinary people. They are also surrounded by sycophants, followers, and exploiters enhancing their delusion. Power is sexy. This isn't just a manner of speech. There is an instinct in the nature of our species that makes powerful people, or people who appear to be powerful, sexually attractive. Though many people playing the power game are too busy with it to be able to have any decent sex, or to care about emotion, affection, and love. The power syndrome isn't only a disease of powerful people, but also of their followers and of most of the people they know or meet, or who are trying to get into their environment. It's a known fact in all human communities, and at all times in history, that the people in the service of power, or wishing to be, thrive and prosper in a stupid symbiosis with the powerful, that tends to increase and complicate the stupidity of power. The victims of this intricate mechanism aren't just the ordinary people who are subjected to the whims and abuse of the intermediaries as well as those of the powers above. They are also, quite often, the people at the top, who become prisoners of their entourage. It is not uncommon, in history, for the apparatus to survive the fall of power. In many revolutions, after the tyrant is removed, power doesn't go to the revolutionaries, or to the people, but is held by the same oligarchies that had it before, or by others behaving in the same way. There can be cases in which power is concentrated in the hands of a particularly considerate and generous person, as there can be wise oligarchies that behave like philosophers in Plato's Republic. There are such examples in history, but they are rare exceptions. It is possible, sometimes, that an intelligent person in the right place may reverse, to some extent, the stupidity of power, but it doesn't happen as often as would be desirable. We shall see, in the next chapter, some, hypothetical, examples of intelligent power. But it is generally true, as Lord Acton said, that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. An example is the end of the colonial system. In many countries it left control in the hands of local cliques, that aren't any better, sometimes even worse, than the foreign powers that they replaced. This didn't happen only in the 20th century. There are many such cases in previous history, and also in some recent events. There are syndromes that can coincide with power, but they can also infect people who don't have it. A reader of the Italian edition of this book commented that arrogance isn't just another form of stupidity, it can be its root. She is right. The delusion of feeling superior is an aggressive cause of stupidity. And so is violence, stupid not only for its consequences, but also for the cowardice and mental weakness that are often its origin. Even when there is no physical abuse, arrogant people do all they can to force others into obedience. And, unfortunately, they are often allowed to succeed. The stupidity of war is a serious, tragic, and complex subject. It would be difficult to cover it thoroughly even in a whole book. But it may be appropriate to summarize here a few comments on its obvious connection with stupidity. 60 years ago, after a second awful world war, there was a probably naive, but not unreasonable, perception that wars had come to an end. Unfortunately this is not so. There have been, and there are, wars and other hideous conflicts in many parts of the world, and no end of these horrors is in sight. The perception that wars can, and should, be avoided is, per se, an intelligent evolution, though it still has inadequate development. So is the growing, but not effective enough, opposition to the death penalty. And the fact that for over half a century, with the painful exceptions of the Balkans and the Caucasus, there hasn't been another war in Europe. For the development of information systems, that in the second half of the 20th century made it widely possible to know more directly the horrors of war, helped to change our perceptions. But, sadly, facts prove that this new state of awareness isn't as strong and coherent as it appeared. We are no longer convinced that armed conflicts are always necessary, as we had been led to believe for millennia, but we seem to be going back, though uncomfortably, to the notion that wars are, sometimes, unavoidable in the turbulent evolution of human affairs. There are historians who have written essays on wars and conflicts, in ancient history and recent events, where stupid decisions have caused all sorts of catastrophes. Examples of books on this subject are The March of Folly, From Troy to Vietnam by Barbara Tuchman, 1984, Der Hinge Factor by Eric Durchsmid, 1998, and History's Worst Decisions, Encyclopedia Idiotica by Stephen Weir, 2005. After 1945 there have been no major wars between European countries, but there have been violent conflicts in Europe, such as internal terrorism in Ireland and Spain, and, in a different way, in Italy in the 70s. They are perverse and essentially stupid, but they are not the same as wars. Wars continue, in several parts of the world. Recent developments, such as international terrorism, all sorts of violence, fanaticism, arms trading, mercenaries, organized crime, aren't as new as they may seem. They existed, in different ways, many times in history. Obviously they are as stupid as wars, with some additional perversion. Not only because of the suffering they inflict and the terror they spread, but also as a result of what is done with the intention, or pretext, of fighting them, with many abuses and distortions falsely justified as prevention or repression. War can be placed, in the stupidology diagram, somewhere between stupid banditism and aggressive stupidity. Many wars are serious damage for all, including the winners. But even when someone gains some advantage, the stupidity of power is devastatingly effective. The gain of a few is a horrible tragedy for too many. All situations are always complex. For instance, in the case of war, as in other conflicts or disasters, there are countless opportunities for the multiplication of violence, cruelty, abuse, exploitation, trickery, and stupidity. But there are also many little openings for the ability to manage difficult circumstances. With some of the best qualities in human nature: mutual help, solidarity, generosity, understanding, love, and friendship. In extreme conditions we find that stupidity remains dominant, but intelligence is never totally missing in human behavior. It would be interesting to find a way of being more intelligent, and human, also in times of peace. The problem is that, while it can, and should, be limited, controlled, scrutinized and conditioned, power cannot be eliminated altogether. Humanity needs leaders. Organizations need people who take responsibilities, and those people must have some power to perform their role. So we've got to live with power, and its stupidity. But this doesn't mean that we must accept, tolerate, or support its arrogance. Or be deceived too easily by gestures, words, promises and declared intentions. Power should not be admired, trusted, or even respected unless it shows practical intelligence in what it does to us and to the world. It should be for us and for the world, and when it's effectively so it's welcome, but the machinery of power, combined with the obstinate stupidity of bureaucracy, often frustrates even the best intentions. As far as I can see, there is no universal or standard solution to this problem. But we are halfway there if we are aware of it, and if we never allow ourselves to be blinded or seduced by the treacherous glitter of power. Chapter 11, The Ways of Power. People who have or seek power are, as an average, just as stupid or intelligent as any other person. But if we follow the method of measuring intelligence and stupidity by the effect of behavior, not motive or technique, the result is that the effects of stupid power make things worse, shown in this diagram, where the red arrow is the power factor. There is a general deterioration in the system, with a shift from intelligence to stupidity. A careful reader may notice that the arrow isn't in the center. This is to allow for the fact that a few people, those in power and their entourage, gain some advantages, and therefore the shift in the system is not from the center of the intelligent area to that of the stupid, but it leans on the lower right side, crossing the harmful fourth quadrant. Based on Cartesian coordinates as defined in Chapter 8. The pursuit of power increases the stupidity factor. The impact can be relatively large or small depending on the amount of power, the importance of matters influenced by power and the number of people subject to its effects, and on the intensity of the power struggle. As we have seen in Chapter 10, power, as a system, is more stupid than basic human nature. We can, however, imagine other sorts of evolutionary process. Let's assume, for instance, a situation in which intelligent power prevails. We would probably see a trend like this. Let's remember that the first quadrant, top right, is the intelligence area, while in the second, top left, we find people who do good for others, but not for themselves. The more someone's behavior benefits others, the higher it is placed on the y-axis. Power, in this case, deliberately chooses to offer greater advantages to the community than to itself, to the point, sometimes, of accepting some disadvantages if they help to improve general well-being. The shift to the upper part of the y-axis is unlikely to be fast, but it tends to be steady and consistent. Such situations are not impossible. There are nearly always a few in some parts of the system. But they depend on unusually well-tuned, well-motivated teamwork, harmonies that aren't easily generated or reproduced, and can fall apart because of changes in the environment or disruptions in their structure. Rare as they are, such teams are extraordinarily effective. Real innovations and improvements in society are much more likely to develop when and where there are synergetic teams, active symbiosis, instinctive cohesion and strong humanity. When such behaviors prevail, the result is a situation like the one shown in the next graph, where the red area marks the position of people in power, the green is the rest of the community. As noted in chapters 7, 8, and 9, in this case people in power cannot be placed in the second quadrant or defined as helpless or self-defeating. If we consider ethic and human factors, their behavior is remarkably intelligent. Here we find all results placed in the intelligence area, with people in power gaining greater advantage for themselves, plus in the x-axis. There are no direction arrows in this diagram because, in the most favorable circumstances, such a system can remain stable, or make slow progress, as indicated in the first graph. In a stabilized, or improving, situation people in power are likely to have greater advantages than the rest, but as this works for everyone's benefit it isn't a problem, as long as two, opposed but synergetic, stupidity factors don't get into the picture, servility and envy. I don't want to complicate the picture, but I think there is one relevant comment. In some particularly efficient organizations, such as those called quality circles, the two areas overlap, because there is no hierarchy and responsibilities are shared. It's a well-known fact that this is the most intelligent form of human cooperation and it can produce extraordinary results. Such systems are basically strong, but they are exposed to damage. They can be warped by internal problems, such as stupidity factors or power syndromes. Or they can suffer from unexpected changes in the environment, or be disrupted by intervention from the outside which, deliberately or by mistake, upsets their delicate balance. The observation of history, and of some specific situations in today's world, reveals that even in the most depressed periods or situations, and in the most degraded environments, there can be active nuclei of this kind. This confirms that intelligence, though rare, isn't an anomaly. It's a natural resource of human nature that can surface in any stage of evolution. The demanding, but not unrealistic, task is to discover the existence, support the survival, encourage the development of these fruitful harmonies, and maybe help small sparks of light to become stronger sources of illumination. After this short digression on intelligence we must go back to the unfortunately overwhelming subject, stupidity. Let's take another look at history. We find that the stupidity of power doesn't have the same impact at different times or in different situations. At times of decline and fall we can assume that the general percentage of stupid people remains a constant, but we find that there is, especially among people in power, a higher concentration of bandits, who often tend to become stupid when the result of their behavior is evaluated considering the unbalance created by their role. While among people who are not in power there are more of those who, in this case, can be correctly called helpless. One of the consequences is that the destructive power of stupidity is increased, and the resulting situation goes from bad to worse. In this case the position of those in power, and of the rest of the people, is placed as we see in the next diagram. Behaviors and situations degrade, moving into the third quadrant, that is the area of stupidity. It's hard to understand, in this type of situation, if the stupidity of power increases the effect of widespread stupidity, or vice versa. In most cases both contribute to a vicious circle and so the entire system deteriorates, as shown by the arrows in the graph. Sometimes this trend can be reversed, but that requires a very special combination, the convergence of intelligent people that can gain power and a strong collective thrust for substantial change. In the absence of such an intelligent mutation, or of an outside influence that changes the basic criteria, over time the system tends to explode, that is, to disintegrate. As we see in the next, and last, graph. If a chaotic situation occurs before there is irreparable damage to society as a whole, or to the entire ecosystem, almost anything can happen. A turbulent vortex generates countless openings for stupidity, but intelligent developments are not totally impossible. For the reasons that I have explained in Chapter 3, comments here are only about the general criteria. We can all be free to apply them, as best they suit our purpose, to specific situations, from the general state of the planet to international communities or individual countries or any large or small organization. I just want to add that stupidity and intelligence, as other variables of human behavior, are not irreparably conditioned by genetic traits or cultural environments. They can change considerably with learning and experience. We could draw all sorts of graphs or diagrams, or in any other way analyze facts and trends, not only to understand them better, but also to look for less stupid ways of coping with the problems. Not for the sake of dreaming, though, at times, it can be comforting, but to make real improvement. We know that it's difficult, but it's important to understand that it's possible. Understanding the diagrams in this chapter needs to be based on the definition of the stupidology graph as explained in Chapter 8. Only here, not in other parts of the book, they are used to help focus on some examples, for those readers who appreciate their use. On other subjects graphic coordinates are not particularly useful, and by mixing different criteria they can't be developed coherently. In any case, for readers that find the diagrams boring or confusing, the concepts are fully developed in the text even when the graphs are not considered. Some comments on this subject are at the end of the appendix. Simple thoughts on complexity.